So we're here today to share ideas from the Oxford Handbook of Career Development, which was edited by myself, Tristram Hooley, and Phil McCash, who you'll see later. And today we'll probably end up with more people are joining us as we go along, but we'll probably end up with more than 150 people online from UK and Ireland, Europe, North America, Australia, even Qatar and Thailand. Also plenty of students and people who are new to NICEC events joining us today. So welcome one and all. I'm just going to say a little bit about how this book came to be. And it was inspired by an earlier book, and that was Rethinking Career Education and Guidance, Theory, Policy and Practice. That's this book. This came out in 1996 and to an extent is the inspiration for today's event. Now, this book was very influential and innovative. It highlighted the political nature of careers. It introduced strong educational and policy studies perspectives. To an extent, it helped to define a European approach to career education and guidance. And it's certainly been sitting on reading lists for my students for about a quarter of a century. Now, we looked at this again in 2016. NICEC held a conference to mark the 20th anniversary of Rethinking. And this was called Rethinking Career Development for a Globalised World. And that gave a chance to reflect on this inspirational text. And that led to conversations about updating Rethinking for a 21st century audience, moving from a primarily UK-orientated text to an international perspective and offering a more multi-disciplinary kind of perspective. So myself, Tristram and Phil began to recruit authors and started work on this. We originally set out to work with Routledge, the publishers of the original Rethinking book, but they decided that career-related publications was not a business they wanted to be in, so we had to find a new publisher. So a little bit of a setback there, but we were emboldened by the quality of some of the first drafts we've received from our authors, so we decided to go up market. We approached Oxford University Press, who agreed to work with us and to locate the book within their Oxford Handbook range. So that brings us to the title. That's how it came to be an Oxford Handbook, and it's the Handbook of Career Development. We chose the label Career Development intentionally to be as broad and inclusive as possible, to capture both the study of careers as a transdisciplinary field and the full spectrum of helping services to support people with their careers. Now, the official publication date is the end of June. It'll be in the warehouses shortly. I will be today sharing a discount code, both in the chat and on the slide later. You can get a 30% discount if you buy directly online from Oxford University Press, and it'll probably be with other online retailers from August. I just want to pay tribute to my fellow editors, Tristram Hooley and Phil McCash. We very much shared the work out equally between us. It's a joint effort. And I learned so much from working with them. I've got more out of this project than I put in, I think. And I estimate that both Tristram and Phil have read 500,000 words each in the process of editing. It's been a long journey, so hats off to my fellow editors for their hard work. And a special thank you to Tony Watts, who wrote the preface for us and lent us some of his credibility, which is nice, and really nice for us to have that connection back to the book that originally inspired us. As a nod to the original text, we kept the introduction as Rethinking Career Development. So I turn now to the chapters and the authors. Hats off also to all our authors and their hard work in providing the all-important content. We have more than 40 authors, quite a few from UK and Europe, but we have chapters from all 5 continents, so it's very much a global project. Authors were tasked with providing a state-of-the-art overview, a summary, if you like, of their topic, but also to make a new contribution, to provide something to take the conversation forward, a new idea, a new critique, a fresh perspective, or whatever. The book has 25 chapters grouped into 3 sections. That's context, concepts, and practice. Although today we're mixing those chapters up a bit just to keep it varied. As we edited, I think there was interesting resonance between quite independently written chapters began to emerge, some debates around the relations between education, work and policy, the role of learning in career development, and career as a cultural phenomenon. That's, for me, were some of the emerging themes. Now, today, you're going to get short tasters of 10 chapters in lightning talk format. So it's a really fantastic program we've got for you today. My only regrets are we can't be together in person, and we don't have time for all of the chapters and all of the authors today. We're cramming in as many as we can. As this is a NICEC event, we're showcasing those authors with an association with NICEC. Just a reminder that there's lots of fabulous contributions that we won't get a chance to highlight today. So hopefully you'll look at the book and get a sense of that. Tristram is going to chair the session for us and introduce the authors, and Phil will wrap it up at the end. We're going to have a short 15-minute break, round about 3:15, and in theory we'll finish around about 4:30. That's all I wanted to say. We're here to get some of these ideas from different book chapters, so let's move straight on to that. That's all from me for now. Let's get into the content of some of our chapters.
Great. Okay, so is that over to me then now?
Over to you, Tristram. You're on mute just now.
Can you hear me okay now?
We can hear you.
Great. Okay, well, it's really exciting. I'm not going to hang around too much because we've got an awful lot of things to get through. So Phil Bakash came up with the idea of this lightning talk approach, and then has handed over to me the job of forcing people to shut up quickly enough, which, given that I know quite a lot of the authors quite well, I know it's not going to be a particularly easy task. So the format that we're going to go with is that people have got 10 minutes to present their chapter and their ideas. If all goes according to plan, we will then have about 10 minutes at the end. And so if people add information about, questions, comments, and so on, I'll try and pick some of those up and feed them in at the end. And if we've got time, go back to some of the authors for more questions. Everybody we've got here is an absolute star in the world of career development. There's no doubt about that. So I'm not going to give everyone an individual huge kind of hype man build up. I'm just going to hand over to people to get going and give them the focus. Now, our first presenter, I think, is the one person who we've got who is not here, but has sent us a video to give his presentation. And so that's Ronald Sultana from the University of Malta. So Michael, can you queue up and roll Ronald Sultana's video?
I should first of all like to thank Peter, Philip and Tristram for inviting me to contribute to the Oxford Handbook of Career Development. Such invitations always represent a challenge, of course, but also an opportunity to think through ideas and issues that are often at the back of one's mind, but which need to be pushed onto paper so that they are developed and rendered with more clarity. My chapter speaks to the topic of career management skills, arguing that we need to go beyond CMS to engage instead with what I refer to as authentic education for meaningful work. I have, in my writing, often made use of the term career and indeed promoted such skills in various forums, not least through the European Lifelong Guidance Policy Network, the ELGPN. There is a lot to be said for CMS. They can be enabling and empowering for young people and adults alike, helping them under self and context better, and facilitating the transition to work. Such skills, knowledge and dispositions are going to be even more vital in a post-pandemic world, where we can expect extensive, even radical, economic restructuring. As academics, however, we are also called upon to not only engage with the world as it is, but also with the world as it could and perhaps should be. Most career learning curricula tend to emphasize the fitting in part, what Roger Simon and his colleagues refer to as learning for work. In my chapter, I work with the distinction they make between learning for work and learning about work. I acknowledge that work remains quite central, not only in terms of livelihood, but also in terms of well-being, social connection, and having a sense of purpose. So, in many ways, having work is, in most cases, better than not having any paid work at all. If CMS can heighten the sense of agency of individuals and groups so that they are better equipped to navigate the vicissitudes of life and increase their chances of entering and staying in employment, well, so much the better. I argue, however, that we need to go beyond this, and that focusing on learning about work opens up important conversations and considerations that engage with the topic work critically. An authentic education, ultimately, is only authentic if it calls a spade a spade. It is authentic if it stimulates a historical and anthropological imagination, which enables us to see how the way we produce wealth, the kinds of relations that we enter into in order to produce that wealth, and the principles upon which that wealth is distributed, have varied across time and space. The focus is therefore not on skills narrowly understood, which ultimately keep us imprisoned in the here and now. Rather, it is on having the tools and normative dispositions that help us understand how work, as currently conceived within the master narrative of neoliberalism, has ended up perverting rights that previous generations struggled for decades to achieve. Rights to a living wage, to a sense of security, to dignity, in contrast to work that today is increasingly the cause of distress, hardship, exploitation, and abuse. All this might appear unrealistic, utopic even. I conclude my chapter by drawing in the work of Eric Olin Wright, who made it his life goal to document real existing utopias. It is of the nature of ideology to convince us that alternatives to the way we live now, however detrimental to us humans and the environment alike, are impossible, not even conceivable. Ideology, in fact, makes us lose our very capacity to aspire. Olin Wright, instead, plays with the word utopia, which can be translated as nowhere, to insist that alternatives are possible now here. He documents multiple experiments worldwide in ways of producing and sharing wealth in cooperatives, in worker-led enterprises, in commons-based economies, in communities that value being rather than having, and so on. These territories of hope, as they are called, including what Piketty refers to as pragmatic utopias, such as universal basic income and flexicurity. These are not oddball, one-off ephemeral initiatives. Rather, they articulate a wider conceptualization of dignified work that offers alternative forms of sociability, social relation and solidarities, caring practices, learning processes, and emancipatory horizons. My chapter, therefore, while acknowledging the adapt-challenge dilemma that we all face on Monday morning, claims that all students of all ages are entitled to an authentic education that expands their understanding of work as a source of personal fulfillment. It claims that most work education programs tend to present the world of work in a reified manner, with participants being encouraged to comply, consent, and collude, rather than to comprehend, challenge, and contest. I moreover make a case for work education programs that promote an understanding of how, across time and space, communities have struggled to improve the conditions under which they labored, and in some cases, even set out to develop economic systems operating with a different logic and values than those of the market. Such a curriculum could be justified if education is understood as an endeavour that both transmits, educare, and draws out, educere, the best that humanity can be. Work education, thus understood, would engage students in conversations that deconstruct, interrupt, and challenge the economic system in all of its complex forms, while pointing out to efforts that clearly show that another world is possible.
Right. Well, thank you to Ronald. It's a shame that Ronald can't be here, but his contributions are always inspiring. I'm going to hand straight over to Peter McElveen on the other side of the world in Australia to talk a bit about career assessment. And I think in their chapter, they've really done it in a very kind of creative and interesting way. So I will pass straight over to you, Peter.
Thank you. It's good to be with you, and congratulations for the book. It's an outstanding book. I was reviewing the chapters this afternoon to get my mind in the space, and it's a superb piece of work for the editors and the authors. I would like to acknowledge my co-authors, and I believe that Jason and Michael might be here tonight as well. It was very much a team effort, and part of our research team, Axel, is we really emphasize the word collaborating, because writing as a single author is a challenge for busy academics. So working with one another has been a great delight for me. So let's get to it. Our chapter was about career assessment. Now, it's an interesting term, career assessment. And I'd like to start with the idea that it's a whole lot more than what we usually think about when we think about career assessment, which was the measurement of vocational interests to help people make better choices, do exploration work, whether they're in school or university or college. This model works. It is one of the most successful models of vocational interest that we've ever had, and it predicts people's long-term outcomes over several decades. So we're not suggesting that we should ignore this thing that has got millions and millions of cases of actual client data backed up by decades of research. But career assessment's a lot more than interest, and you can see here on the diagram, it fits in one small area of the whole picture of a person. So what we approached our chapter with was, how do we create a comprehensive approach to career assessment? One that takes into account the traditional things that have been measured in that formal sense of assessment. So that, you know, the vocational interests, of course, but there's the dispositional traits of personality, which have a very significant impact upon people's career choices and their work decisions and how they move through education and training. But one of the interesting things about dispositional traits is there's not much you can do about them. They're fairly fixed. They change over time, but they're fairly fixed. The interesting part that we should be focusing on is career adaptations. Those skills and qualities that can be developed via education and training experiences, so that we can actually take people forward rather than just simply assess and then make some kind of diagnostic statement about them. Another part of career assessment, which doesn't tend to get it as emphasised as much, but it's very strong, is the career narratives, the stories that people tell about themselves. So when we're looking at this comprehensive picture of career assessment, it requires us as practitioners and as researchers to not just think about one particular modality of a person's life. We have to think about it in terms of those contextual factors, the life events around the person, but also those traits, adaptations, and the stories that make up an individual person in his or her context. That was the frame of the way we think about career assessment. In the chapter, we thought, okay, how are we going to condense a topic that is a textbook in itself down into a few thousand words? So we took an applied approach to the chapter, which was to focus our points on employability within higher education. Now, in the UK and in Australia, graduate employability is a very important topic. It's not so important in other places where career assessment is done, but for us, it seems to be something that drives a lot of policy and a lot of educational work. Part of the chapter, we outlined the traditional stuff. Okay, what are the things that are measured by psychometric tools, by all sorts of formal systems? But the important part is bringing those two things together, which is the measuring as well as the quality, the stories that people have to say. So part of that was giving an example. So Jason Brown's work that he's leading is the development of the Australian graduate employability scale. So that's a battery of psychometric tests which targets the qualities that, from a psychological point of view at least, enable a person to do better in the world of work. And Michael Healy is also leading a different approach, which is much more about how people can use writing, career writing as Michael calls it. And some of us remember the great work of our colleague Franz Myers. It's in that space. So when we think about career assessment in an educational setting, it has to be career assessment of, for, and in learning. It's not just some diagnostic thing that we do, walk away, make a decision. So for us, it's about how do we take all of the technology and the research that we have around career assessment and use it in an educational sense. I think that's the strength. One of the problems that we've isolated in all of this is that it's been abused and misused in all sorts of different ways. Now, in Australia, we have a national literacy and numeracy testing program. That has been a political football. Unfortunately, what happens is that people end up attacking the research and the system, the assessment system, rather than attacking the politics that's abusing it and misusing it. So we make a point about that in the chapter. I think the next phase of career assessment is going to be very, very exciting around new methodological advances. Latent profile analysis is the one that we've mentioned in the chapter. LPA enables researchers in that career assessment space to do what practitioners naturally do. They look at their students and their clients and they know that they're a mixture of qualities. We can now replicate that sort of thinking, if you will, that sort of practitioner logic in a statistical sense. So this new modelling approach enables us to see mixtures of qualities, of traits, of characteristic adaptations that indicate certain career outcomes. So it's a big contested issue. So I've got two references down there where you can see led by Jason and Michael. This is the employability space. We're in there, we're talking about it, saying, okay, it's not yet settled. So if you're interested in reading a little bit more about that type of work, please jump on and have a look at those papers. Well, I'll stop there. No one likes an academic to talk forever. So that's it from me. Thanks, Tristram.
Great, thank you so much. And that's brilliant, brilliantly concise and fascinating stuff. I'm going to move straight on to Phil McCash, who has both been our co-editor on this volume and also has written a really fantastic chapter, which he's now going to talk about. So over to you, Phil.
Thanks very much, Tristram. Before I kick off, can I just check in with you, Tristram, that the slide is displaying okay?
It is indeed displaying very nicely.
Oh, thanks very much. That's great. Well, hi, everyone. My name is Phil McCash, and I'd just like to start by saying thanks very much to my co-editors and to NICEC and to my fellow contributors for contributing to and making this project. I'd also like to remember and express my appreciation for the work of Bill Law, whose work featured in Rethinking and has influenced my own work. My presentation focuses on cultural learning and career development. Culture and learning are about who we are, whether walking down a city street, busy in the workplace, interacting on social media. We are all immersed in cultural learning all the time. The immersive aspect means it's not a choice. Cultural learning theory helps us answer 5 related questions about this state of affairs. Who do we learn with? What do we learn? How do we learn? Where do we learn? And why do we learn? Our responses to these questions enable us to plan and to take action. In career development work, they help us agree on roles and trustworthy relationships with intent and clarity. They assist us in negotiating the focus and goals of the work in useful and accountable terms. Finally, they enable individuals to reoccupy those city streets, workspaces, and social media spaces with renewed purpose and meaning. So just in terms of my presentation, I'm going to say a little bit about the background to cultural learning theory, and then I'm going to attempt to summarize cultural learning theory and relate it to practice, principally via means of what we term the learning alliance. And there won't be time to go into the examples, but I'll just highlight some possible examples that are contained in the chapter in more depth. So cultural learning features in a number of important career theories, the work of Bill Law that I've just mentioned, Phil Hodkinson, and Gideon Arulmani, who'll be speaking later today. The cultural learning theory of career development is integrative and represents a fusion of over 50 key concepts drawn from career and educational theory. It draws from two main traditions: the interactionist sociology of the Chicago School, where it was argued that career is made up of the work and non-work activities of both men and women of all social classes. It's the moving perspective in which persons orientate themselves with reference to other people, forms, and social structures, and interpret the meaning of their lives. Career, it is argued, helps us understand the nature and working constitution of society. Cultural learning theory also draws from educational theory with a cultural focus, particularly the work of Jerome Bruner, who argues that culture is a toolkit for understanding your world. Cultural learning theory emphasizes the cultural connections that influence us and indeed forge our identity. It's made up of 5 facets: the who, what, how, where, and why of career. And cultural learning theory states that important learning happens in both informal and formal ways, and that formal career development interactions draw from the 5 facets through a learning alliance. So just to explain this graphic a little bit, the large pale blue area relates to the wide range of learning experiences that make up our career and the attempts of career theory to describe it. And the smaller pentagon relates to the practice of career development work, principally the learning alliance, which is at the core of one-to-one work and group work. And the blue arrows show the connections between lived career, career theory, and practice. The who of career is concerned with roles and relationships. People act in a range of roles: worker, student, family member, and learn in relation to significant others. They also learn through individuals they've never met, but encountered through their symbolic artifacts, such as writers, singers, designers, artists, and musicians. And the learning relationships forged thereby may be more meaningful than those with people in their immediate social circle. In practical terms, the who facet highlights the importance of agreeing about learning roles in the learning alliance. The what of career is concerned with the contents of learning. Topics include career interests, abilities, aptitudes, skills, career information sources, career management behaviours. For example, career management behaviour is a common topic of discussion in work and educational contexts. Learning topics extend to career problems, types, values, and development tasks. For example, career-related values are often discussed and explored at times of change. Topics also include organisational knowledge, political decisions, role allocation systems, income distribution systems, social justice, diversity. For example, political decisions can affect the availability of jobs and the quality of working life. The wide scope of the what facet emphasises the potential of career development work for individual and societal transformation. In practical terms, it highlights the importance of exploring the topics on which the Learning Alliance will focus. For example, the pervasive influence of community expectations can be discussed and explored in work with individuals and groups. The how of career relates to the processes and actions of learning. In temporal terms, learning processes take place over seconds and minutes to months and years. Individuals revisit learning throughout their lives, from early childhood to late life. Learning processes entail intellectual, emotional, and physical dimensions. They also include unconscious processes and tacit knowledge. Learning processes can be broken down into increasingly fine-grained learning actions. Participation, for example, involves engaging, feeling, and sensing. Comprehension leads to naming, defining, and selecting. Conceptual development entails analysing, critiquing, and evaluating. Creating new concepts and projects involves applying, designing, and reimagining. In practical terms, the how facet informs the creation of measurable goals and outcomes for the Learning Alliance. The where of career relates to the importance of context and space. Context relates to the located, spatial, and situated nature of learning in homes, neighbourhoods, communities, work, and education. Space highlights the importance of situatedness, cultural identity, and communities of practice. And these spaces are inevitably influenced by the intersections of class, gender, disability, sexuality, and ethnicity. Learning contexts also relate to physical and virtual media spaces, such as websites and social media. In practical terms, the where facet focuses on helping clients learn to make effective use of space through the Learning Alliance. And lastly, the why of career relates to the importance of meaning and story making in learning. Meaning and story making entail learning about our deep connections with others and the wider world, the golden threads that connect and reconnect us culturally. In practical terms, the why facet enables practitioners to make room for meaning and purpose in the Learning Alliance. So just to say that my chapter goes on to discuss practice further. It discusses shaping the Learning Alliance through reflexivity and the start, middle, and end phases of the Alliance. And it also highlights a range of exercises and activities, including a cultural influences collage, a career management styles card sort, golden threads activity, and some bridging, reviewing, and networking activities, and a life story exercise. So just to finish, the Learning Alliance is about enhanced connections in career development. Through it, clients can count on you for an invitation to participate, both in the discussion and in wider life. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much for that. We've started to get a few questions through now. If people would like to ask any more questions, I think we're going to have time to get to a few at the end, so that will be great. But I'm going to hand over now to John Goff and Siobhan Neary, who are going to talk about the profession and the role of profession in career development.
Hi everyone. Nice to see you here and see everyone's name written today. Thanks a lot for coming along today. Just to introduce ourselves, I'm John Goff from University of Warwick, where I'm a senior teacher fellow. Siobhan, did you want to say hello to you about yourself?
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Siobhan Neary. I'm head of the International Centre for Guidance Studies at the University of Derby.
We're going to take the proceedings in a slightly different direction now. We're going to be looking at the career development profession, such as it may be termed, and our chapter looks at professionalisation, professionalism and professional identity, which are very interesting, debated and sometimes contested terms, which is what our chapter seeks to grapple with. Just to give you an idea of what we'll be doing is, first of all, is the importance of the overall question title. It's fair to say that not just in the UK, but in international context, that the career development profession has been biffed and battered around by pretty rapid policy change. And it's a testament to the resilience of the profession, one could argue, that its relevance and importance to government and to policy has persisted. But at the same time, it's raised serious questions about the nature and the scope and the basis of the career development profession. There are three key perspectives which can inform the debate about professions. First one is the trait approach. Second one is the regulatory bargain. And the reason why that's underlined is because that's the key perspective which Siobhan and I used when we were discussing the questions of professionalism, professionalisation and professional identity. The final strand, which we don't cover as much today, although we do touch on it, is subjectivity. The idea that people create their own sense of who they are within the profession. And it's a question which Siobhan and I's respective PhDs and our subsequent work in research and also teaching I've been particularly concerned with. So if you are interested in exploring those further, then do check out the research which we've done. But our main focus today will be the regulatory bargain, what that is, and how the sector is doing in relation to this particular point, which is what Siobhan will be talking about in their part of the presentation. We don't just navel gaze on the whys and wherefores and the woes of the UK context. Siobhan in particular has taken an international perspective, and there are common sorts of themes and motifs which have emerged from that. And finally, we shall conclude. So, how do jobs become professionalised, or what is a profession? The first perspective which you could take is the trait approach, not to be confused with the trait and factor approach of career development theories, although there are some similarities there. It's what essentially distinguishes a profession from a job. So what's the difference between, without using a crude comparison, between a cleaner who can do a very professional and indeed vital job, as we're finding in these pandemic times, as compared to a barrister or a solicitor or a doctor or a chartered accountant or a civil engineer or whatever. So what is it essentially that would distinguish the cleaner role from the roles which I've just mentioned? And some writers who espouse the trait approach would identify things like higher levels of knowledge, indeed esoteric knowledge, which most lay people wouldn't have about how to do something. The other one, which is a key question for professions, is trust. So if a medical practitioner or a solicitor or a barrister breaks trust, whether that's confidentiality or misuse of funds or manipulation, then the public wrath on those figures can be quite substantial, because we do expect a much higher level of integrity and trust to be embodied by such professionals. The key one, which points also to the regulatory bargain, is the control of the entry criteria to the profession. And part of the regulatory bargain which Larson mentions. Larson's work also draws on the work of Weber, where he talks about this idea of the kind of social exclusion. It's where one group in society is able to secure its esteem relative to others through this kind of exclusory bargain. And so if you apply it to the professions, this is called the regulatory bargain. And there's a key quote which may help to define what a profession might be from this kind of structural, functional perspective, which goes, professions are occupations with special power and prestige. Key thing there is that society grants these rewards because professions have special competence in esoteric bodies of knowledge linked to central needs and values of the social system, and because professions are devoted to the service of the public above and beyond material incentives. Now, there's an awful lot packed into that quote, which we don't have time to unpick. But I guess what was interesting from our perspective when writing the chapter is to what extent has the career development profession in various national and international context managed to secure from government the legal right to, for example, set entry criteria, the curriculum for training, and to give professional bodies or similar the right to regulate, admit, and even exclude individuals into the profession. So the perspective which we decided to use for the career development profession in our chapter. So what is the, so just to go through the kind of regulatory bargain for you. Okay, so as I said, the professional body has got structural power, controls the entry routes, polices the profession and the legal authority to enforce standards, has got esteem and influence with government, though part of the battle of professions in the neoliberal, global capitalised context which we often are in, is that government often pushes professions to become much more marketised, much more open, much freer, so that allows competition. And there's also the continuing debate between professionalism and managerialism, so that organisations seek to make professionals organisationally accountable rather than professionally accountable. So these are some of the kind of benefits of having a regulatory bargain, but also some of the tensions which can arise from those. So I'll hand over to Siobhan, who will take us through what how the career development profession is doing.
Thanks, John. That's really, really helpful. So what, as John said, we were trying to do is trying to explore the concept of the regulatory bargain and to consider whether there were examples that actually met the full criteria. The reality, as I'm sure many of you will be familiar with, is that there are elements across different countries and different contexts within the career sector. And I'm just going to touch very briefly on a few of those just to give some highlights. We do go into much more detail, obviously, within the book. I think what was important for us is that we found elements in lots of different places. So, for example, within Scotland, the alignment, the strong alignment between government policy and the framework that's developed around training for careers practitioners and the academic qualifications provides a power base in terms of more control around access to and progression through the profession. Also looking at countries like Ireland and Iceland, which have defined training and qualifications required to be recognised as a practitioner within those contexts. There's also legal requirements in some countries, such as Finland, Poland, and again, Iceland, around professional qualifications, and within Finland specifically, legal requirements for careers education as well as training. And there's also hybrid models that have demonstrated how a career may have evolved from areas such as teaching and psychology to become then established as a careers practitioner. So John, if you can move to the next slide. So in terms of the subjectivity, we said we'd only very briefly touch on this. I think the important thing around identity for us was very much that around how individuals focused their own identity, how they took responsibility through resilience, through concepts such as restoring, and the importance of professional identity through postgraduate education and continued investment in CPD. And what these identities presented really was that we can have professionalisation as a whole process, which is incredibly important, but the role of the individual within that and the acceptance and promotion of self-professional identity was an important concept within that. So the final slide, as we're moving rapidly out of time, and we were very ambitious to try and do what we were doing, is recognising that this is an ongoing debate and an ongoing question. There is no definitive end to this. What we've been able to identify is examples from different contexts and examples in different countries of how the elements of the regulatory bargain may have become created or may just be espoused. But it's important to recognise the importance of structure, agency and power within all of this, and how individual practitioners also need to have a role in ensuring the professionalisation and promoting the work that so many of us do on a day-to-day basis. So on that, I will hand back to Tristram.
Great, thank you so much. That's excellent, really, really interesting. We'll come back to some of these issues in a second when we get to some questions, but I'm going to hand over to Kate Mackenzie-Davey, who's going to talk a little bit about organisational careers and how that kind of intersects with some of the things we've been talking about so far. Excellent. I can see your slides. Very nice. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, hello, everybody. Thank you very much indeed for coming. And of course, thank you to the editors and co-authors in this fantastic handbook. Congratulations on getting that off the ground and getting us all here. So what I was looking at was the role of the organisation in career development. And as with many others, in attempting to make sense of and bring together this incredibly broad and diverse area, I looked at this through 3 different lenses. The first one is the one that probably all of us are most familiar with and most comfortable with. That is this idea of the organisation as a context for individual careers. It's where careers take place. It's a kind of traditionally container. Perhaps that's more challenged recently. The second way is looking at this, the second focus is to look at this from the organisation's perspective. So it's thinking of the organisation both as a constructor of careers through organisation strategies and policies, and also as a consumer of careers, the idea of what is it that organisations expect to get out of careers. And then thirdly, to move away from this duality of the idea of the individual and the organisation, and to focus much more on organising as a process and the idea of careers as a kind of process linked to both individual processes of identity and organisational processes of structure. So thinking about the individual focus, what's happened here is we've moved in organisational career development from the notion of a traditional bureaucratic career where individuals seek to be developed and promoted within a particular organisation to one which is seen as being boundaryless or protean. That is, it's individually driven. And this idea of boundarylessness or boundaries within careers is probably something that all of us have had to cope with, particularly with COVID, of thinking, where are those boundaries now? And it came from this moving away from an idea as an organisation as a conventional solid structure to organisations as shifting, as unpredictable, as unreliable. So individuals could no longer expect to be able to map a career through an organisation, but had to actually take responsibility for themselves. And also that this was in many ways liberating from the shackles of having to fit in and become the organisation man. But whilst there is on the one hand that sense of liberation, there is also the imbalance of power. So within that, on the one hand, you've got the freedom, but on the other, there is that sense that organisations may not guarantee a career, and that individuals without valued skills end up with very precarious employment. Taking a more organisation focus, we're thinking here about the organisation strategy and what their approach is, what they are getting out of this. One of the difficulties of some of this boundaryless ideas of careers as individually driven was it left the organisations almost without a role. They no longer had a sense of providing this framework. And one response to this from some consultancies was the notion of the war for talent. What organisations were now doing was they were fighting in the marketplace for the most valued people. This, of course, fits into this idea of the winners and losers within this notion of career. But more traditional ideas of talent management have, in fact, been more, in some ways, almost paternalist, and have thought much more of segmentation, of what the different organisations are looking for, what different roles might be within an organisation, and about how individuals might fit or not fit within that. So you might get the idea of some organisations which are clearly very short-term focused, where they are just looking at a quite precarious workforce, to organisations which see themselves as having a much longer-term focus and having an interest in the development of their employees. And one of the ways of looking at this was through Handy's ideas of the Shamrock organisation, where you have almost an elite of employees. You have, as one part of this, you then have a professional or consultancy group who are brought in for specific tasks. And then you have the precariat, the less skilled, less highly valued, who might be on part-time or very uncertain, insecure work. The third approach is to move away from this dichotomy, to start focusing on the process. So this is moving to this idea of careers as being that link between individuals and organisations, to look at this notion of organising. And this might be seen as organising through different systems, through different structures and different fields. It's looking at how do individuals and organisations actually interact to produce these career processes. It might be through fairly long-standing approaches, through ideas of social exchange and psychological contracts renegotiated as part of a career. It might be through this idea of role transitions, of boundary crossings, or indeed of being in some sense of liminality between boundaries, between organisations or between different occupations and professions. And that idea that it could also be conceptualized through a notion of a career script, where there are expectations from the organization about what you might be doing, but that the individual may also ad-lib a bit, may use this to construct their own particular views of career. And that sense also that all of this is taking place within a much broader institutional background. So what we're looking at here is that sense that it's not just about the organizational interest or the individual interest, it's about how these two systems are mutually co-constructing each other, how any activity by one has an impact on the other, which takes place over time. So that focus fits in with a lot of the new ideas, focusing on organizing rather than organizations, and it may be more useful in terms of conceptualizing what careers are within the current political and social structures of organizations. So moving forward, this is thinking about organizational career development as a joint project which involves both mutual interests for individuals and organizations, where organizations benefit from careers, they're constructed by careers, and they actually provide a context for these careers, but also where there are conflicting interests between ideas of flexibility, of security, of how these different approaches may play out. And within this incredibly complex field, it's also trying to find a balance between a critical and wide-ranging review of the evidence and models which are useful both for organizations and for individuals to use. And a lot of this is taking place within much broader arguments about the importance of social context within careers and the importance of this for the construction of organizations. So rather than we're moving from this idea of thinking of concentric circles with the individual in the center and then the organization around it and the broader social context outside that, to much more webs of mutual influences, as Jubilee talked about, this sense of individuals as both being caught up in the web and also creating them themselves. And I think even beyond that, thinking about this idea about organizational career development, it's actually challenging that very idea of the universality of our concepts of career, to think more specifically about different cultures, different views of organizations beyond employment. And I think my final argument really is that rather than seeking one overarching organizational career development theory, it's useful to celebrate the diversity of different approaches that are offered.
Great, thank you so much. What an appropriate note to end the presentations on, because we've certainly seen quite a wide diversity of different approaches presented so far. We've got about 10 minutes where I wanted to pick up on some issues with the presenters. If anyone's got any more questions, then please put them into the chat, and I'll try and pick them up. But one of the things that's come up from a couple of people is the issue of COVID. Obviously, it's been a major part of all of our thinking. I think we're all sure that COVID must have changed career in some way, but I don't know if any of the presenters would like to say in respect to the particular aspect that they were thinking about, how that's made a change and how they think it will make a change going forward.
I think one of the things is that it has raised very much the interrelationship of responsibility between individuals, organisations and wider political and social structures in supporting people when perhaps organisations aren't functioning. So either through furloughing or indeed through increased home working. And I think there's a lot of interesting discussions going on about the implications of that for the future for organisations.
Great. Would anyone else like to come in on that issue of whether COVID is changing some of the things? I mean, obviously, most of these chapters were submitted before the COVID outbreak, and we're now in a kind of different world. Is there anything that you would change now if you were thinking forward?
One thing that we've picked up certainly through the courses that were run at Warwick, as well as I'm sure others are picking it up, is the implications of remote guidance or coaching on professional sense of who they are and how they can remain professional and skilled in working remotely with clients, and the extent to which they need to develop a new skill set. And some of these have provided benefits as well as some challenges. And it's interesting that the advent of having to use technology has been seen as a bit of a challenge to how practitioners often see themselves.
Great. I mean, one question that I've got, listening to all of the presentations that people have given so far, is it's asking quite a lot of professionals. I mean, some of the stuff that we've been talking about, I mean, you know, Peter's stuff on career assessment, you know, it requires a lot of skills and knowledge. You know, Phil's stuff's dealing with very complex theory. Sorry, I'm about to have my cat appear on screen, I think. It's in full Zoom style. But I wonder whether people have got any reflections on the capacity of the profession to take forward some of these issues that we've raised.
Well, in absence of somebody else jumping in, my view is yes, because practitioners are usually quite resilient, creative, and once they've got used to what it is that they need to do, and found ways of negotiating and navigating what they do with clients and so on, then yeah, you know, and I think as we've certainly found through teaching, in many respects, some learners or clients might actually prefer things through Teams or Zoom or wherever it might be, because it's more accessible, although it does present challenges.
Yeah, I think that I do have faith in the profession. Just to kind of continue John's point, I think that one of the issues that we discovered with the handbook is that we didn't want it to be like other handbooks, which kind of go through each of the individual kind of career theories one by one, because that's now getting increasingly kind of complex to make sense of. And so there's a number of chapters in the book. I mean, mine is one example, but Julia Yates, who is speaking later, is another example. And there's another example, I think, from Jerome Rossier on the narrative approach, where in different ways we're seeking to be integrative in relation to career theory and try to kind of make sense of the field for the profession so that they can, yes, in turn make sense of it too and help their clients make sense of career development. And we're particularly, I think, thinking about the relationship between theory and practice. We need integrative frameworks that make sense in terms of translation into work with individuals, whether that's in groups or one-to-one.
Great. I wonder whether, Kate, you could say a little bit more about the professional component of organisational careers, because, you know, I think when we're talking about the profession, we've probably got an idea in place of who those people are, and it's a bit less clear as to who are the actors in the kind of discussion that you were having.
I think a lot of organisations are themselves quite unclear about this. I would obviously refer to Wendy Hirsch as being the great expert in practice within organisations at the moment. And I think But I think what's happened is that in some areas, the responsibility for careers has moved away from the traditional HR position to being seen as something to do with risk management. So when you're talking about this very segmented workforce, you've got a difference where you've got careers of the highly valued elite being managed as something which is seen as a great asset for the organization. And then you have a large area that are probably outsourced and are seen, if at all, very much more in market terms, in terms of finance and what goes on there. But I think Wendy in the chat also raised this idea that linking these things together, that COVID has raised issues of well-being and brought them very much to the fore, as there has been perhaps a need to make care for valued employees more explicit now. As you have less of the informal, taken for granted interactions day to day, you have to have something which is more perhaps more explicit, and it's not clear to me where that responsibility for career development in organisation currently lies.
Great. I mean, one of the things that I suppose we were wrestling with as we pulled this book together was the diversity, and we've heard some of it in this session. You know, people are coming from disciplinary, different places. People are coming from kind of different areas, different theoretical places, and so on. I wonder, just as a kind of final thought, if anyone can give us any ideas on this as we head into a break. But I mean, is it viable to continue to hold career development together as a field when we've got all of these different things going on, which you know, at least sort of in a straightforward way, don't necessarily all connect up? Are people still talking to each other? Are they still learning from each other?
I think it's one of the great strengths actually of career development as a field is that it encompasses that diversity, and I think it would be a shame to lose it. And I think there are costs in the totalizing meta narratives that bring things together and oversimplify them.
Any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that there's also a nice question from Emily about the global dimension, and I think that it's easy for individual enclaves to kind of develop in career studies, where, you know, maybe just the trait factor psychologists are speaking to each other, and the sociologists are speaking to each other, and the organizational scholars do the same. And I think one of the nice tricks, if you like, of the Oxford Handbook is that we have got these different perspectives speaking to each other. We've got organizational perspectives, we've got psychological perspectives, we've got sociological, and our field is divided, but it's not quite as divided as one might think. And it's by having handbooks like this that we can hopefully develop and enhance the conversations between areas. And just to pick up on Emily's point, Gideon will be speaking later, and there's also another chapter by Marcelo Ribeiro in the book that is specifically kind of addressing sort of global issues in career development. And we've also kind of set ourselves the challenge of learning from their contributions, because Marcelo is particularly keen that we develop new hybrids, new conversations as the global north speaks to the global south and vice versa.
Exactly. And where else could you learn about the role of shadow puppetry in the delivery of careers and education interventions? So there's much to be dived into in this book. I think we're going to take a short break, just a 15-minute break now, so people can go and get a coffee and so on, and then we'll move on to the second session straight after that. So we'll be back at 3:30. So the next session will follow the exact same format. We're going to have more of these lightning presentations. Well done to everybody so far for keeping to time so well. And we will go through these. Again, a little opportunity for discussion at the end, and then I'll be handing over to Phil to engage in a bit more discussion and debate at the end here. Please keep the questions and comments coming. Obviously, there's a lot of interesting ideas out there, but anything that you want to particularly raise with the authors, that would be great. I will now hand over to Pete Robertson to talk about his new theories for public policy and career development. It's a really great paper that I've cited numerous times already. So please explain what you've been doing, Pete.
That's great. Thanks for the build up, Tristram. I'm going to be talking about the aims of public policy, what governments are trying to achieve when they run careers services and what they say they're trying to achieve. Now, there's already been some fantastic work done on this. In the earlier years of the 21st century, there were international comparative studies of government policy by a variety of people, notably NICEC Fellows, Tony Watson, Ronald Sultanas, and a range of other collaborators, done marvelous work looking at what governments are doing and what they say they're doing when they're addressing career issues. And out of that emerged a kind of international consensus around what governments were doing. And this seems to have been pretty widely accepted by big important transnational organizations, European Union, OECD, and so on. And this continues to be a very influential framework. So in a way, we've already got a pretty damn good framework. And that's this. So we could group what governments are trying to achieve into three main categories. First of all is an economic category by pursuing effective career services in order to smooth the operation of the labour market, to reconcile the demand and supply of labour, and so on. Essentially an economic objective. Secondly is a similar learning or educational objective to smooth the operation of the educational system, to prevent waste through dropouts, to smooth the transition of people from education into work. And third, a category of goals that relate to social equity, equality of opportunity, gender, class, ethnicity, and so on. So widely influential framework, pretty good to start with. Now, what I was interested in is as I kept coming across kind of social contributions that career guidance could make, potentially, that perhaps weren't fully recognised and perhaps didn't fit into these categories. So I started thinking about, well, what we've got here is a framework which rather brilliantly describes what is already. It describes what governments do and what they say they do. But what it doesn't do is lay out the potential for things that governments could do in relation to career development that they're not currently doing. So how could we develop this? Well, to do this, we need some kind of framework which tells us what governments are supposed to be doing. And it would be lovely if that framework was up to date, and it would be lovely if that framework was truly international and relevant to developing and emerging economies, not just to the rich Western nations. Well, it just so happens there is such a framework, and it's the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. It's on its second iteration now, and this framework lays out 17 areas that governments should be working towards for the benefit of their people. This is what good governments should be doing, and it's been pretty widely adopted. It's had quite a lot of coverage. So I thought, well, let's look at this, and maybe we can map those existing framework of goals we've got onto this, and maybe it will suggest some ones that aren't fully recognised or that we haven't really got to grips with yet. So I started doing that, and it seemed to work. So first of all, going back to our three goals we had to start with around the labour market, for sure, that's in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals framework. the notion of decent work and support for groups living in poverty is very clearly represented there. So we can map on that objective very nicely. Secondly, educational goals. That's very clearly and very directly represented in the United Nations framework. So that's all hunky-dory. We can stick with that. And also social equity. There are two goals identified in the United Nations framework that directly relate to issues of equality and inequality. They actually separated out gender. I've kind of left it together here because I think gender interacts with other kinds of inequalities, and it's already the way we have it already set up in our current thinking. So let's just keep it the same for now. Looking at the United Nations framework of those 17 objectives, now some are more relevant to careers work than others for sure, but we can certainly identify some objectives that are not fitting into our current three-way framework. So I'm looking to add 3 additional potential goals for government policy in relation to career development. So I'm going to introduce those 3 now. The first is health and well-being. That's the third of the UN goals. Now, I've done some work around the connections between health, particularly mental health, and career development. Someone else who's very interested in this in the United States is David Bluestein. And I think this is an idea that's been bubbling up the agenda. We know there's a strong connection between unemployment and mental health. Governments have kind of been talking about this stuff recently, particularly in relation to COVID. What are the mental health impacts of lockdown when we have to shut down the economy? So this is an idea that's been coming up the agenda, and I certainly believe, from the evidence I've seen, career services can potentially contribute to the public health of the nation. There may be other agencies that make a bigger contribution to that, but we can certainly make a contribution. So I'd like to put health and well-being on the table. The second addition I'd like to make is around the environment. Now, the environment features very prominently in the United Nations Development Goals. Lots of the objectives relate to that. Now, this is on our agenda already. We have a green guidance agenda. The next NICEC seminar is addressing the climate crisis with people like Peter Plant, colleagues from Canada and Denmark getting involved in this. So this is already on our agenda. I don't know to what extent we're really talking to governments saying this is something you should be using career services to support, the transformation to a green economy. But that's a potential policy objective for career services. So that covers quite a lot. There's 1 or 2 of the UN objectives maybe aren't relevant at all, but that covers quite a lot of them. But we're left with an interesting odd one out. And that's another one I want to put on the agenda, even though there's been little or no work done around this. That's the relationship between careers and criminal justice systems. Now, I think there is potential for career development to contribute in this area, and that's partly through the rehabilitation of offenders. More importantly, perhaps effective career services actually prevent people getting involved in crime by offering them alternative, viable and attractive lifestyles going forward in education and work. So I think we have an unrecognised contribution that career development services could make to reducing crime. And at a societal level, where there's huge inequalities between ethnic groups, religions, nationalities or ethnicities, maybe fair sharing of career opportunities could be facilitated by career services, and that might help to create a peaceful and harmonious society. Nobody's really researched this yet, but perhaps they need to. So to pull it all together, what I'm saying is we could suggest to governments, well, you're already using career services to promote effective operation of the labour market, the education system to promote social equity, how would you feel about also using career services to promote health and well-being, to promote a green economy, protect the environment, and to contribute to having a peaceful and just society? So that's essentially the argument of the chapter in a nutshell. Let's keep our existing framework and maybe add to it. Let's see some potential policies that are not yet been realised. Also in the chapter, I talk about some cross-cutting themes: sustainable careers, social justice in careers, and using career services to promote social change. I haven't got time to get into that now, so that's a little teaser to encourage you to read the chapter. So that, in essence, is the argument. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks. That's fantastic. We'll be coming back onto policy in a minute, but we talked in the previous session about this challenge of trying to decide whether career development theory and thinking can really still be integrated. So I'm going to ask Julia Yates to talk about her chapter, which makes an attempt to actually draw all of these different theoretical traditions together into a common conversation. And I think it's a really interesting way to look at it. So I'll hand over to you now, Julia.
Thanks, Tristram. Can you hear me and see the slides okay?
Yes, pretty good.
Right, so I was delighted to be invited to contribute to this book, partly to be associated with all the other illustrious authors, which is fabulous, but really because I'm such a big fan of career theory. I think it's so important and so interesting, and I have some quite clear views on it. And Ronald mentioned this right at the start, that actually writing a chapter is such a brilliant way to kind of clarify and refine your own thoughts. And it's also a great opportunity to share some of your ideas with the wider audience. So I think my particular angle on career theory has been shaped by the fact that I started off as a practitioner. So I spent 15 years working as a careers advisor in schools and colleges and universities, and then became an academic where I'm teaching career practitioners about career theory and also using it in my own research. And I think one of my conclusions is that what makes a useful theory for a practitioner is quite different from what might make a useful theory for an academic. And I think as a practitioner, this was certainly my experience, that when you're sitting in front of a client, you're not particularly bothered by some of the kind of debates that go on within the academic world. You just want to know, does this theory work? Is it going to be useful? So that's my description of what a career theory is. So it aims to reduce complex career behaviours into concepts which are easier to understand. And these two things are quite crucial. It tries to explain and it tries to predict. So that's really important in theory. The theories that we read tend to be very influenced by the individual researcher's discipline. So we get career theories from psychology, from sociology, from education, from economics, and each of those disciplines will influence the kind of lens through which that particular academic is looking at careers. And we also get a wide range of different philosophies. So even within psychology, you can get career theories that are very kind of positivistic and that go right the way through to social constructionist type theories, which have such a different opinion about what reality is and what the nature of knowledge is. And because career choice and career development is so complex, we end up with so many different kind of theories, so many distinct theories. Career choice and development are interdisciplinary. If you think about an individual client, they're drawing on all sorts of different kinds of influences and disciplines and ideas. And yet the people who write the theories tend to be coming from one particular lens. So that's why we end up with so many different theories and concepts that we're trying as practitioners to make some kind of sense of and to integrate and to use in our practice. I've just got a list here of some theories that a lot of these I've used in the chapter, some of these I've used in my own research, but that's not all of them. That's just a starting point. But you can just see that as a practitioner, when you're in intervention with a client, it's really difficult to know what to do with that. I think sometimes we've ended up with a sort of chocolate box approach to career theories, by which I mean that people are encouraged to kind of pick one and reject the others. And I think some of this comes from authors of theories who often imply, perhaps not explicitly, but implicitly, that theirs is the only theory that you need. And then book authors or academics who try and teach about this, when they're trying to make sense of the whole array of theories, they quite often do it chronologically. So lots of books start with, you know, let's talk about Holland in the 50s, and then Super's work in the 60s, and then let's think about Ken Roberts in the 70s. And this all means that for a practitioner, it's really hard to integrate these theories with each other because they're not presented in that way. And I think it's impossible, no, not impossible, really difficult to integrate them with practice. So what I was trying to do in this book is trying to make a start to think about, instead of the sort of chocolate box approach where you pick one and reject the others, trying to think about career development theories as a landscape, a single picture, within which there are lots of different things you could focus on. So each of the theories would be represented by a different sort of aspect in this image, but you can see that they all work together to build up a coherent whole. And when you're focusing on one particular element, you're very much aware that it fits into a big landscape. You're not thinking that that is all that's important. So what I tried to do was a sort of thematic analysis of some of the career theories that I've come across. So trying to kind of put aside those ideas of disciplines and tribes and chronology, and just thinking about what are these career theories talking about? What are they saying? What are the key messages? And I've come up with these sort of 4 themes, which is understanding my identity, understanding my environment, how we learn about career development, and then psychological career resources. And quite key to this is the fact that these are not 4 standalone themes. They're all absolutely integrated and interwoven within each other. So I'm just going to talk through the 4 of them. So starting off with thinking about my identity. Now, your identity is your sense of who you are. And theories think about it in terms of the present, who you are now, but also thinking about the past and what aspects of your earlier life have influenced where you are now. But also there are some theories that look at future, so future work selves, possible selves. Theories look at me from the inside and me from the outside. So the me from the inside is about kind of how I see myself. What do I think are my strengths? What are my values? What matters to me? What are my particular interests? And the me from the outside is more about how do I fit in? So what kind of workplace would this work in? How could I see myself within a broader whole? Then there are theories that look at different versions of me. So there's me at work, there's me at home, different kind of identities in terms of that. And then there are different stories that I tell, so that even the same version of me, I could talk about it in different ways, depending on the message I want to give or the audience I'm talking to. And those same stories can be re-authored, which is obviously, we know, a very important part of career practice. So my next theme then is about understanding my environment. And within this, one of the important things that comes out of the literature is this idea of a bi-directional influence. So I will influence my environment and to some degree control my environment, and my environment can control and influence me. Some theories think about the opportunities that we have in terms of our environment, what opportunities the environment brings to me, but also can have an influence of the opportunities that we see, which is a kind of different aspect of it. And then there are theories that look at the different specific things that have an impact on our career development. So some look at sort of chance events, some look at relationships, look at the impact of parents or friends, look at the impact of teachers or the media. So then my third one is about how we learn about career development. And there are some theories, and you can see this one's quite linked to the previous one in terms of where do ideas come from. So how is it that we learn about the world of work? How do we learn about what different jobs are? And how do we learn about how we could fit in to that whole environment? And then there are theories that look at the processes. So how do we process ideas? So once the ideas come to us, how do we make kind of sense of it? And how do we eventually narrow it down to one particular idea that we're going to take forward? My fourth one then is about psychological career resources. So these are the sort of constructs within an individual, but also perhaps linked to the environment, that allow people to move forward. So some of these career resources help people to make positive choices. So one of the things that's been most studied in the career world is that notion of career self-efficacy, which is your belief in your ability to make a good career choice. And then there are other career resources that focus on positive behaviour. So what things like proactive behaviour, concepts of adaptability and resilience. So what kind of specific things can influence positive behaviour? So those are my four sort of themes within this. I think you'll see that they're all quite interrelated. They absolutely don't stand on their own. But I've also tried to get away from the more sort of chronological and perhaps to some degree the kind of discipline idea of it. In terms of how this can be used, I think it can be a really useful framework for helping people to understand the whole gamut of different theories, so we can see where they fit in, but also how they relate to each other. I think a framework like this can be used in sort of specific one-to-one interventions as a way to normalise and validate clients' experience. That's always an incredibly useful thing of theories, but also to help us guide our conversations so that we make sure we focus on the right sort of most useful areas. But I also think something like this could be really useful for thinking about career education, to think about how we start going about making sure that people have a kind of broad range of understanding before they start to sort of narrow down and make their choices. So that's just about my time up. I will stop sharing and thank you very much.
Oh, great. Thank you very much. That's great. That's great. We're now going to move on to hear Gideon Aramani, and in many ways he'll be picking up some themes that certainly were discussed by Phil in the earlier session. But I will hand now over to Gideon to talk about his chapter.
Thanks, Tristram, and this is a chance for me to thank all the editors of the book for having given us the opportunity to write in this important book. So let me try. Now I have a PowerPoint, which I hope will work. Yeah. Right.
Excellent. We can see that very nicely. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. So, for those of you who've seen the book already, this was an opportunity for us to pull various aspects of this cultural preparedness approach that I've been speaking about for some time. It was an opportunity for us to bring the various things we've done with this approach, bring it all onto one paper, as it were. As you know, this was a multi-author paper, and that in itself was an opportunity and an accomplishment for me, because I usually prefer to write alone. But these are my colleagues who work very closely with me and used some of these ideas. Sachin is a professor at the Government College of Teacher Education. Sunita works in Kathmandu, and she runs an NGO called Antarang, which reaches thousands of children in Nepal. Mary Bone is a teacher of counseling at one of the universities here in India, and Sajma, when we wrote the chapter, worked with us at Promise. Yeah, I'm just starting my stopwatch. Right. So together, what we tried to do was to describe the cultural preparedness model as a framework to understand how culture mediates the process by which individuals and communities engage with careers and livelihoods. So broadly, the chapter presents some of the key propositions of this model, and most importantly for us, it's the applicational part which was so important. And Julia's presentation right now really brings the spotlight onto why do we do research? Why do we create all these theories? At the end of the day, the practitioner must be able to use these ideas. So that was the driving motivation for us to write this chapter. The second aspect of the chapter was that we wanted to see how these ideas actually provide a template for intervention. And we use the constructs of the cultural preparedness model to bring out 5 guidelines, perhaps, that could be kept in mind when an intervention is devised. One of the most important interventions that came out of the cultural preparedness model was Jiva. Many of you know about this. Jiva is a specific intervention that we developed, and we have a fair amount of evidence to show that this style of intervention works. It's been implemented in India and then adapted in nearly 30 other countries. The other big controversy in our field is this bad word here, isn't it? Assessment. And sometimes, you know, in certain contexts, when I use this word, people look at me strangely. And in other contexts, when I don't use it, they look at me strangely. It's the old controversy that exists between the quantitative psychometric approach and the qualitative person-centered approach. So what we try to do with this model is to develop a mixed methods approach where we draw upon the lived experience of clients, and then on the basis of that we try and get a number to satisfy people who need numbers on their profiles, and that was called the Strengths and Accomplishments Questionnaire. I can tell you that it's worked quite well. You know, it was 10 years ago, and we've adapted it to nearly 30 different countries, as I said. And right now, just before this meeting, I was in a one-day training session with a group in Tunisia, where we've actually produced a new Strengths and Accomplishments Questionnaire for that country, completely the data derived locally and the culture taken note of. Another aspect of assessment that we've explored is assessment, so to speak, of children with special needs. Yeah? In countries like India, until you do a test, you can't declare that you've done career guidance. We've been brought up there, either the student nor the parent, you know, at the end of it, they say, okay, so when is the test going to come? So we have this test to satisfy those cultural needs, as it were. So we've experimented with using this mixed methods approach for children with dyslexia who really have difficulties with paper and pencil testing and so on. Also, career development needs of immigrants, you know, to assess their experience of arriving in a new destination and struggling with those issues. So that's an overview. What I'd like to present today, hopefully there'll be enough time, is the key propositions of this model and what I spoke about, some of the guidelines that we've tried to practice when we develop interventions. Many of you know this already, but let me run through it again quickly. At the heart of our cultural preparedness model is the notion of cultural learning, and these are pictures that are used to describe what cultural learning means. Both these children, different cultures. One, this is an Islamic culture. This is a Christian culture from Ronald's town in Malta. Results from just growing up in the culture. It's not the result of reasoned thinking. There is a source of information which the child valorizes and relies on. It's an unconscious absorption, and this is the part. This idea is actually from Tomasello, where he says that human beings are biologically prepared for culture in ways that other primates are not, and he describes this as an ontogenetic niche, a context for development. So cultural learning leads on to the idea of enculturation, where people learn the obligations of a culture and internalize these obligations. Now, this enculturation is different from socialization in the sense that, for example, you've seen this slide, you take greeting, these are all the different ways of saying hello. This is a particularly interesting one. So there are so many different ways. Greeting is the socialization aspect of it, but the way we greet varies from one group to the other. This leads to the idea of equilibrium, and here you have this beautiful picture of this lady who does agriculture in this way. She's happy with that. She's comfortable with this methodology. It's habituation to a way of life. It's a mental or emotional balance. Yeah? Brings an internal stability. And move on. Then, of course, this is not permanent, is it? Equilibrium is always affected by acculturative forces, external influences on a culture, and it's usually the minority or the submissive group that is required to embrace the living patterns of the dominant group. So we come to the alteration of equilibrium, where these acculturative forces could be consonant or dissonant with an existing equilibrium, and that's where the career guidance element comes in. Is our intervention, is it an interference with an existing equilibrium, and how do we turn it consonant? Right. So some of the examples of alteration are the result of changes in economic policy, guidance methodology, and even now what we're experiencing, this tremendous upheaval of public health related issues. So to summarize, this is the model, yeah, enculturation based upon this human ability for cultural learning, yeah, leads to enculturation, which leads to equilibrium, which and there is a bi-directional relationship between acculturation and the equilibrium, which finally brings about a new equilibrium. And I see career guidance stretching itself through all of these different processes. So therefore, what I'm trying to say is that career exists now in almost all economies and contexts, but in some contexts, Western contexts, it's natural to that context, whereas in other contexts, which are relatively non-Western, industrialized, non-Western, this is the kind of engagement with work that we see. So the manifestation of career is seen in two broad contexts. So that's in a nutshell the theory itself. Now the question of intervention, another 2 minutes. Something that we try to keep in mind is that when you're developing an intervention, to recognize cultural leadership. The role of external agents, a career development specialist or a theory or a model, can only be secondary to the already present leadership structure within the cultural system. And here is this slide that I've used so often. This was a village, an island chief in the Maldives, and he said to me, as long as there are fish in the sea, there is no need to think about what you describe as a career. I was annoyed in the beginning because he wasn't paying attention to me. Then I realized, I need to pay attention to him. He is the cultural leader of that country. And it's only when we started working with him, letting him lead, that whatever we were trying to accomplish in that country had some traction. The second principle that we try and keep in mind is for us to expand the definition of client. Career theories have got over-focused on the individual, but in many, many cultures, collectivistically oriented cultures, individuals are expected to conform to the norms and wishes of the community. So here is another, this is the father, he's a mason, and this is the son. And he said to me, I'm a maestri, I'm a mason. I learned this job without going to school. So why should my son go to school? So we need to adapt and recognize who our clients are. The final, amongst the 5 that we've described in the chapter, the final one here that I'm presenting is for us to learn to identify, valorize, and integrate cultural symbols. There are cultural symbols in agriculture. So culturally anchored symbols are manifested in all traditions, rituals, language, and invention. And here, looking at the story as a method of guidance. Legends, folk tales, parables, all of these are rich with culturally grounded ideas that we can then expand as a tool for career development. And when we do this, we are drawing upon the possibility of interpreting universal themes into a local context, and at the same time of extending culture-specific themes to broader contexts. So I leave it there. This is just a repetition of what I said. But I'd like to leave you with Aladdin's lamp. And there are other presentations that I have made where the question I ask myself is, should we give away our lamps for new ones, or is there value in shining up, relighting old lamps? Thank you. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much for that. We're just covering so much ground today, and we'll hopefully be able to come back to some of this and talk about it in a bit more detail. I'm going to hand straight over to Anthony Barnes, who's written a really interesting chapter about careers education and the ways in which it can be transformative. So Anthony, please take us away.
Thank you, Tristram. Hi, everyone. I'm chapter 19, so I'm in the practice section. And so that's inevitably more about the how than the why of career education. But as a career educator, I've always been interested in making sure that practitioners understand why they're doing what they're doing. And for career education to be transformative, you've got to understand the links between transformative learning theory, and for that I lent heavily on the work of Jack Zero, and some of the career education or careers theories that illuminate transformation. So I went for 5 main ones that I think are accessible to practitioners: cognitive information processing, career learning, career construction, systems, and chaos theories of careers. Just a quick introduction about some of the stances I've taken in the chapter, and I'm pretty certain you won't all agree with me on everything I've done. So a bit of discussion and debate, always good. So I've emphasised the transformative nature of career education, and that's about making big differences in a person's life. And it's a notion that's well understood in adult learning, and I wanted to apply it to career education in schools and colleges. But of course, I recognise that for a lot of practitioners, they'll regard it as idealistic and unrealistic because of the education system they find themselves in. But I would say to them, there's no point in doing career education if you're not going to try to be ambitious. So it is about transformative career education, but I don't want to just dismiss the transmissive and transactional issues that take place in career education. So I think really it's about understanding the pluses and the downsides of all these three approaches. Another stance I've taken is I'm passionate about career education in its own right. I don't downplay it as an activity of guidance or obscure it behind a 3 or 4 letter acronym like CEIAG or CWOW, or hide it in another construct like economic well-being. My other concern is that I expect the same rigour to apply to career learning as would be applied in any other learning in the education system. In other words, it should be about learning and not just information giving. And it should also be about richness and challenge. If you think about it, many parents can't keep up with the maths their children are learning after the age of 7. In a way, I'd love the same to be said of career education. And then my last stance is, I think of career education as being emancipatory, to use one of Ronald Sultana's terms. It's about what career education can do to advance causes such as social justice, social change, active citizenship, cultural diversity, and protection for the planet. So just to give you a bit of the flavour of the chapter, in keeping with the editors and publishers brief, I've tried to make it relevant to the needs of practitioners working in different education systems. But of course, there are many common issues. So one of the issues that we all face is how do you put career education in the curriculum? How does it feature in curriculum design? Embedding it is really difficult. You've got to balance it. Is it a subject or a quasi-subject? Is it going to be a cross-curricular element? Is it going to be a co-curricular activity? And by co-curricular, I mean it's something that is planned in a way that's extracurricular, but what the term extracurricular doesn't describe is the way in which co-curricular complements the formal curriculum. So the answer to my question is actually it's a combination, needs to be a combination of all three. We also then, when we're planning career education, we have to think about its learning aims, and a very well established model that we've seen used in North America, in Europe, is the 3 elements of self-development, career exploration, and career management. Now, at this point, I would say that if this was the BBC, they would say that other frameworks are available. And there is a new framework coming out from the Career Development Institute, which I'd encourage you to look at. Now, to realise these learning aims, in the chapter, I've emphasised the need to have powerful and compelling learning and teaching processes. So I thought we could just briefly have a look at some of these. Under self-development, for example, we can do a lot of really important work with narrative, telling children, getting children to tell their own stories. This is a workbook from Mark Savickas, and it's on the vocafor.com website. You're all familiar with using card sorts and things like that as well to help young children and young people do their thinking. And some of this thinking is really well best put into a career portfolio type learning environment. So portfolio-based learning can be an important focus for personal planning, for thinking and reflection, for recording experiences and achievements, and drawing together everything to do with the self-development and career management, including keeping track of the applications they're making and so on. And actually, special schools often do this very well. For them, it's a form of self-advocacy and self-presentation for their students. And of course, with digital and social media developments, career portfolios can become even more creative and exciting. I owe a big debt to Frans Myers and Marina Coopers in the Netherlands for their work on powerful learning environments in career education. So we've just mentioned one, the portfolio-based learning. You can see here in this slide, which is clearly pre-COVID, students on work experience. First-hand direct experience, active and participant experientially based activities have the potential to be transformative. For example, work experience enables less advantaged pupils to build their social and cultural capital. Now, a third pedagogy that is really powerful for transformative career education is dialogic teaching. And Rick Armstrong in the UK is really well known for that. And here's one example of a cooperative and peer-to-peer method of teaching that is called the jigsaw classroom. You may be familiar with this, but if you see here on the right, you've got a home group here. And what you do is you send people into temporary groups where they have to master a piece of information, which when they're sure they've understood it all, they go back and teach it to the people in their home group. And Chris Watkins, who was at the Institute of Education in London, a big friend of NICEC's, was a great advocate of that as well. Project-based learning, again, is another powerful learning environment because it involves taking, doing an extended piece of work, taking a question which you then try to answer either individually or in a group if it's a group project. So something like investigating women's experience of working in the construction industry would be a very rich topic to pursue. Just going back to what I was saying about dialogic teaching, I put up some pictures here of child labour, and what a skilled teacher can do is get children to look at what's happening in these pictures, then to really think deeply about the causes and effects of child labour and how it can damage careers, prospects for children. And then finally, looking at the learning aims around career management and using things like mentoring and coaching, portfolios again, to develop an understanding of career skills. So implicit in all this, and this is my concluding remarks, implicit in all this is the need to have professional and professionalizing practitioners with expertise in career education at primary, secondary and tertiary level, who demonstrate leadership, who have drive and determination, are willing to engage in professional learning for themselves and their colleagues, and use and from time to time participate in research and evaluation. And it's also about ensuring sufficient time and resources, but sadly that is often above the pay scale of careers practitioners. But hey ho, that's another chapter for another book. But I'd just like to thank my editors in NICEC and Oxford University Press, who sometimes seem to know what I meant to say better than I did myself. My apologies to anyone present if I've inadvertently misrepresented their work, but please get in touch if you want to discuss anything that raised in the chapter at another time. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. That's been excellent, and we'll come back onto that. I think there are some real big themes emerging here about relationships between theory and practice. But we're going to return to policy for our final session, or final presentation of this session, with Tibor Borbély-Pears and John McCarthy, who've written a really interesting chapter, which is which actually looks at, well, how does this career development policy that we keep talking about, how does it actually work? So Tibor and John, would you like to take us away? Ah, there we go, great. John, I can see your presentation, but I can't hear you. I wonder if you're still on mute.
Okay, you can hear me?
Okay. Yes, excellent. Take it away.
Okay, so just to thank very much the co-editors for inviting myself and Tibor to contribute to this excellent publication. What we set out to do was to present in a very simple way and concrete and realistic way the whole process of policy development and the tools that government use to implement policies and the organizational variables involved in the same thing. And we tried to take examples from different countries to illustrate each of these points. And what we did notice was a lot of incoherencies between policy aspirations and the tools and the outcomes of these. And we went on then to look at the role of the international organizations and networks and activities in promoting national policies for career development. And finally, we set out to draw lessons from all of this. So our starting point is, what is public policy, and how what it is and what it isn't. Okay, how government intervention is expressed, and then looking at the examples of regulations, economic incentives, and information campaigns, which are the three main policy tools used by any government in any country for any type of policy. So even if you look at COVID, it's very simple to understand. There are regulations, there are economic incentives, and there are information campaigns. But in the field of career guidance, I think a lot is around regulations and economic incentives, and information campaigns rarely appear. And then we also want to look at the actual implementation of policies, who implements, and what are the organizational variables that impact on policy implementation. So let me move to the next one. So the starting points, just to say from our personal experience at national and international level, a lot of this is sometimes it's cosmic events, it's timing. For example, if you look at the resolution on lifelong guidance in 2004, the very first one, the president of the European Council at the time of the education ministers happened to be a career guidance counsellor. So sometimes cosmic events and timing is important. Other times it depends. It might be an advisor to a minister who is an interest in the topic. And so there's nothing really very rational about all of this, and quite often it's non-sequential. So if we look then at the government intervention, and what shape does that take? Well, we have plenty of arguments that have been recited in by the OECD, the ILO, the LGPN, among others. And I think what we have seen then is when we've looked at the different policy instruments and their application, what we notice is a lot of incoherency between aspirations and regulations, between aspirations, regulations, and economic incentives, between aspirations, regulations, economic incentives, and the organizations that are involved in implementing. And the particular one is the non-use of information campaigns. I think we can only find in Scotland really good examples, and maybe Learn Direct previous to that. Or a quick look at policy implementation evaluation studies at national level, almost non-existent. It's really sad to say, but that's where it is. But we do have these proxy, what you describe as proxy evaluation studies. These are the reviews by the OECD, the ETF, the CEDAFOP, ELGPM, and then the International Symposium country papers. And now I pass on to Tibor.
Okay, thank you, John. And thanks a lot for the invitation as well. I think I'm just going to add a few more highlights, as this is really a teaser for everybody to read the whole book and each chapter. So one of the key points we also want to highlight the different type of languages of political science and economics. Although in the last couple of decades, as you can see in the slides, there are plenty of discussion about lifelong guidance or career guidance or workforce development policies all around the world. 50, 60 countries are already discovered in that field. But that the reality is, if we really check the language of political sciences and the triple P model, which is politics, policy, and polity, which is about the institutionalization of political structures, then most of these studies are not really using the full language of the political sciences. This is also very much applicable and very often arguable for economics, and especially for labor economics, which is about manpower. I can recall a couple of discussions with labor economists in Hungary, and when I first mentioned them that what we are doing is actually career guidance, the biggest and first obstacle for them was to conceptualizing what career guidance actually is and how we can divide it from different type of interventions government has been doing. My second point is, if we can move for the next slide, that still what we are observing in all of these discussions, that the complete benchmarks of lifelong guidance policy or career development policy has been still missing at the global level. And the reason is for that, obviously, the lack of polity. Then in most of the countries, what we are observing as career guidance services are not institutionalized. There are obviously cases in France or in Denmark, I'm not listing many countries, where there are institutions, but this is very different from, let's say, from labor administration or from the school system, which makes all of this evaluation very fragile in the political arena. The third point is that most of these descriptions, most of these studies are more like analytical one, and I think we can move to the next slide. Very much describing the structures and then what we know about the so-called PDCI circles, so what is actually happening with certain levels of indicators. This was, by the way, one of the last activity of the European Lifelong Guidance Policy Network, that we try to establish the set of indicators, and it was offered to the countries whose work in the GPN to start testing this out. And unfortunately, in the last 7-8 years, it's not happened yet. So what we usually do, or what we are looking for in political discussion, also the policy as a content usually uploaded to the decision makers level, is the PDCA cycle. So if we are not able to close the loop, if we are not able to see the whole policy loop, which is basically described in the first part of our article, then it's very hard to make sustainable arguments with the decision makers. And probably the last point about the conclusions, or two last points, if I may, which are probably need to highlight. Quite obviously, we are still living in the margin of public policy. So career guidance in the last couple of decades, obviously because of the more structured labor markets, and obviously because of the globalization, yeah, I'm going to finish within a few minutes, are very much in the heart of policy discussions. But on the other hand, this is always like an ancilla in that sense, as the Latin word says, the female servant. So, I mean, when we are talking about schools policy, when we are talking about the policy of public employment services, social inclusion policies, career guidance is usually attached, and these attachments makes us very happy who are working in the field of career guidance policy, evaluation and design on one hand, but on the other hand, it also makes us very sad, because it means that these policies are not really designed around the needs of the users, but these are very often just an additional service in top of the services of public employment services or the school system or whatever. And the last point where I want to really close with a positive sign, what we also learned in our study that based on all of these interesting activities of the World Bank, the ILO, the OECD, EIGP, and ICCDPB, I'm not listing all of these bodies, there is a significant interest in many countries to learn more about the nature of career guidance policy, which can be used obviously as a big opportunity for all of us who's engaged in making career guidance policies better in countries. Thank you very much for all of your attention.
Brilliant. Thank you so much to Tibor and John, but to all the presenters in this session. I think we've covered a huge ground. I'm going to actually pass over to Phil in a second just to run the kind of final session of this seminar. But I think what came out to me most strongly from that last session particularly was, NICEC says it's about policy, practice and theory and the relationships between these things. And I think repeatedly we've heard about challenges in building, effective relationships between these different elements of the picture. And I mean, I hope that the book that we produce will play a role in bringing all of these things into the same conversation. But I recognize that it's not enough, and that we do need to think more about how we create a more kind of ongoing dialogue between these different parts of our field, and we don't end up with different kind of concerns or different approaches to the field operating in kind of parallel worlds. So I'm going to hand over to Phil now, who's going to run the kind of final half hour. So I hope people can stay with us and give us a chance to kind of debrief on some of what we've heard and think a bit more about it. Phil, over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Tristram. Yeah, we've got about half an hour to have a broader based discussion, and hopefully Michael can give me a hand in just picking up in the participants list who wishes to raise their hand or ask a question, and we'll hopefully try and get around as many people as possible. We'll also make some time just to kind of make some closing remarks, particularly about the chapters we've not had a chance to speak about today from our other contributors who aren't so directly linked to NICEC. So we'd like to give them a bit of a shout out as well. But over to you for now. Any questions, statements, comments from the audience? might be a little bit difficult to make yourself known. So if you just wanted to unmute yourself, then you could unmute yourself and ask a comment or ask a question.
Phil?
Hi, John.
Yeah, can I just raise a point, and it's really around the presentation by Pete, which I really liked. A point that you made, Phil, was about the identification of the kind of different goals, the learning goals, the educational, the labour market, and the social equity goals. But in essence, before, and if I remember correctly, before we had these international reviews, these aims were never identified. And it is almost as if the aims were abstracted by the reviewers from the behavior they saw in different countries, rather than these aims being the cause of the particular behavior in different countries. All right. So, and in a sense, we're almost like in a catch-up situation. It comes back to the point that that I was making earlier, that the whole process is not very rational, and the development of career services in countries are more like historical accidents. All right, and sometimes the rationale is not thought through, and it requires reviewers to actually identify what is actually happening in the behaviour itself.
Okay, thanks very much, John. Pete, could I invite you to respond to John's question?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, John. Yeah, I totally agree with what you're saying there. I think the international comparative reviews have done a fantastic job of describing what governments are already doing, but I think it falls back on the career development professions in different nations to articulate what their potential contribution could be. And I think, you know, careers advisors working at the coal front know that they can have a profound effect on people's lives, and I think we kind of know this from personal experience of delivering services. But there's space for us to be more articulate and sophisticated in the way we perhaps sell that to government. As you've said, often career development is marginal in policy making, so it's not an easy sell. And you know, maybe I'm a dreamer, but I'm kind of imagine that if we can show there are multiple benefits in different kinds of channels from providing career services, then that could help us in that. In doing that. I mean, I appreciate I'm talking from Scotland, where we have a very strong state sector, and it's going to be starting from a different kind of base in many other countries. But yeah, no, thanks for that. I agree totally with what you're saying.
Thanks, Pete. Well, whilst we've got you there, I just thought that it'd be worth raising in the chat that there was a number of comments as you were talking about CIAG and criminal justice from Elaine, Stephen talking about age and offending, Emily talking about welfare to work providers doing work in the criminal justice system, and Siobhan referred to the National Career Service. Bernadette also referred to an online programme for young offenders in Ireland. So I don't know if you wanted to comment on any of that.
Yeah, thanks for those. I've copied those comments from the chat to save them for later because they're really interesting and useful. I wasn't suggesting there isn't work going on connecting career guidance with the criminal justice system, because there's nothing new. There's been good work with offenders and other categories of people over many years. But what I was suggesting is that it doesn't tend to be seen as a policy goal for us, and that to explore this we would need to do some research really and develop a research evidence to support that argument. You know, research evidence is not is necessary but not sufficient to influence policy. You need a lot more than that, but that's a starting point, and I think we're probably at an early base in relation to that particular policy objective.
Thank you very much, Pete. I notice there's a few more questions coming through in the chat. I'm just going to try and pick up on them. There was a question, I think, for John. I think it's from Elaine, asking John to speak to the connection between the policy cycle and place that career development is seeking. John, does that make sense? Can you say anything in relation to that?
Yeah, well, the policy cycle, if you were to look at it in a very rational way, and if you read a textbook about policy development and the policy cycle, what happens in reality is very different from how it should happen. All right, and sometimes, for example, if we look at reforms in career guidance in France, back in 2005 and 2006, there were revolts in the suburbs, in the ghetto areas, and all of a sudden career guidance took on a political importance that it didn't have prior to that. And so sometimes it's just events create change. All right, and somebody was talking today about, well, or somebody has raised the question in the chats about, well, what is the impact of COVID being on the provision of career guidance and maybe the delivery of career guidance, and in a sense, like some policies are simply reactions to situations, all right, and they're not really thought through. And so that's one aspect, and the other aspect that strikes me is that a lot depends on the people who are involved in writing within the ministry or within the department, because some of them have no idea what they're writing about, and some of them have a slight idea, and therefore what actually ends up gets into the press or gets into the public, like, it's not really somebody who is sitting down as an expert on the topic and thinking the whole thing through. It's something like somebody's written a draft, handed it to the next level up, which sends us to the next level up, and there's so many different hands in the document that finally comes out that in the end it looks quite banal. What I'm trying to get across is that it's not at all what the textbooks say it should be, and in the end it's actually a very human activity, and therefore, you know, the more levers that we have, that Pete was talking about earlier in terms of the sustainable goals, the better. All right, and we got to use all of these levers to try and push career guidance up the policy agenda.
Thanks very much, John. And just noticing that John Goff has also got his hands raised, and he may want to speak to Elaine's question as well. So over to you, John. If you're still around, John. No, perhaps John Goff is no longer with us at the moment. Maybe
he's on mute, Phil.
Ah, is it? John, you're muted, I think.
John, we still can't hear you, unfortunately. You might need to log out and log back in again.
Okay, well, it may be that Siobhan wants to say something in relation to this anyway, if you're still here, Siobhan. Don't know. Okay, well, I'll maybe see if John comes back to join us when he's logged in again. There was quite a few. I'd like to bring in Julia if possible, because there was quite a few posts as Julia was talking. Lena expressing enthusiasm for the metaphor that you supplied of a map to understand the kind of landscape of career theory how that will be helpful in teaching. And I think Claire made a sort of similar kind of comment. So would you like to come back on that, respond to that at all?
I think teaching career theories is really hard. I'd love to hear more about what Lena, are you there still, Lena? Because it sounds like the map was what you use. Is Lena still there?
Yeah, I'm still here. I use the metaphor map for.
Tell us how that works, Lena.
Pardon me?
How does that work? How do you, what do you do?
Well, I use it the same way that you use the landscape to show that there's different maps. We have maps over cities and we have maps in order to go in the forest, and you use different maps for different purposes. And the idea is that you have to, as a career practitioner, you have to find your own map and put together pieces from different parts in order to be able to function as a professional.
That sounds really interesting. And do you find your students, does that kind of land with your students? Do they sort of, does that work for them?
I hope so. I really do hope so. But I'm thinking of using your circles and have them work in groups and map different theories to your circles to see how they start relating different theories, because I do recognize the problem of going time-wise and not kind of making the connections and seeing what inspired what and how the time that we're living in or they lived in while finding the theories link to the ideas that come up in the theories. So that's what I'm looking forward to doing with my students.
That sounds really interesting. Will you let me know how you get on with it?
Yeah,
really
sure.
Yeah, I do think it's quite interesting, isn't it, the way that people so often talk about theories chronologically. So somebody mentioned in the chat this work that Wendy and I have been doing with career practitioners in higher education, and we asked them about theories and whether they used them and what they used. And one of the things that I just noted so much is probably the single most common theory that they mentioned was John Holland. And it's not just that they were kind of, you know, sort of experienced careers advisors who've been around for ages. This was people who've just recently qualified as well. And I just, that kind of strikes me, because John Holland isn't perhaps the most fashionable of theorists at the moment, I would say, in the UK. So it's interesting that people are still drawing on his work.
Yes, it may be to do with this chronological issue, Julia, that he's the first one to be
He comes
taught.
first, yeah, quite.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. And I think you're really onto something with this kind of getting away from the chronological idea. It strikes me as a good way forward. Can I just bring in Mark and David, who at opposite ends of the chat talks about, I'm going to bring in Anthony here, I think, talked about the Gatsby benchmarks. Mark, I think, said something like, or wondered whether the Gatsby benchmarks might stifle creativity. And David, just listening to Anthony, has suggested that we need a new set of resource materials linked to Anthony's chapter that addresses some of the, shall we say, deficiencies of the Gatsby benchmark. David or Mark, would you like to kind of just say a bit more about that before we turn to Anthony?
Hi there, it's Sarah actually. I'm using my husband's Zoom, so I've been been an imposter. I'm relatively new to careers guidance, but I work in a sixth form college, and as with many other institutions, we're kind of marking our progress in terms of careers development using the Gatsby benchmarks, which is really nice. But I find that it does tend to put career teaching and education into very much a tick box. You know, we tick ourselves, have we done work experience? You know, how many students have done work experience? How many have had an employer engagement? And it becomes very much a compartmentalized thing. So then the students aren't seeing the lovely connection and the interplay between all of those experiences as one unit of developing an awareness of career. And I wondered whether you guys, as the the far more knowledgeable folks on this had an opinion, really.
Brilliant, thank you, Sarah. Maybe I could turn to Anthony now. Anthony, would you like to respond to perhaps Sarah's comment, and if you can, David's comment as well?
Yes, I think you're right about the tick box approach that Gatsby encourages, and it's become more of a tool for accountability than for development and improvement. And I'd really like to see us move more to a situation where career leaders in schools and colleges are connected to networks where they can share good practice, where they can develop provision which with a mind to the real impact and outcomes. One of the things I couldn't squeeze into my 10 minutes was the importance of assessment for learning in careers, and Peter McIlveen talked about it. Assessment for and as learning is really important. It's something we don't do, but if we do it, we will have a real sense of impact, which Gatsby doesn't encourage, because Gatsby, you can tick and the box and say, well, I provided this activity, but you haven't really thought, well, what difference has it made? So it comes back to my transformation agenda.
Thank you very much, Anthony. David Andrews, I don't know if you're still present in the meeting, but welcome to come in on that before we move on from Anthony's chapter. And just reminding that John as well, John Goff, that we can come back to you, John, if you like, if you've managed to make a connection.
If David's not there, Phil, can I just quickly say that
yes,
he and I have had a conversation about this, about the need to create the next generation of resources. Back in the beginning of the 21st century in Scotland, they created a resource called Careers Box. Well, of course, it was very much a paper-based resource, printed-based resource then, but we could do so much more now, so much more easily. And I'd really urge that if we are able to do that, that we go for co-construction, that we work with learners and stakeholders and partners to create the new resource, and we don't just try to do it ourselves. I think that would be a really powerful way of creating some new resources.
Great. Thank you very much, Anthony.
Can you hear me?
Oh, hi, John.
Yeah, you're right. I was talking before, but obviously my for some reason it wasn't coming through. I thought my internet's gone on the blink again. So, well,
the floor is yours, John.
Yeah, it was the connection between the policy cycle and professionalisation, and I did a little detailed response back to directly to Elaine. It's a very good question. In England, there is no career guidance workforce development policy other than in relation to careers leaders, and there won't be on the horizon, I don't think. In Scotland, there is more workforce commitment, development commitment, but it's very much tied to the skills agenda. So, which is why the work that Siobhan and I have been doing is very much how practitioners need to drive their own agenda and connect with other practitioners, just as Anthony was mentioning. So that despite structures or policies, then we professionalise in much more individual, building our own communities type way, rather than necessarily relying on policy, because I don't think policy will drive it at the moment anyway.
Thank you very much, John, and stay on the line because there's a couple more sort of linked to your talk, I think. Nigel says, thanks for a really interesting afternoon. The concepts of the regulatory bargain and the organisation viewing career development in terms of risk management rather than HR has really got me thinking. And Charlotte's, maybe this is drifting off your one a bit, but The emphasis on experiences of work and employer engagement fails to recognise the importance of preparing young people for these experiences. So, don't know if you'd like to comment on either of those posts.
Yeah, I think the regulatory bargain is a useful framework. It's relatively depressing because you kind of think, well, is that what we've achieved? And I think we've sort of said, well, it's partial. At the same time, I think what it also shows is the scope that the profession has got through things like the CDI and ICAS and so on, for pushing against government and its various agendas to achieve a degree of leverage that will release funding as far as possible. I think that's probably the kind of work that the professional organisations are most concerned with. I think also the role of CPD is pretty crucial too.
Great. Thank you very much, John. Just opening it out to all of our other speakers. I can see Tristram there as well. Any of our other speakers would like to say any closing remarks or pick up on any comments? Tristram, are you coming in on that one, or have I just?
Yeah, no. I mean, one thing I was just thinking of was, which I think relates to this discussion, is that I do encounter practitioners who are very engaged with theory. I encounter them quite regularly. I mean, as I think Julia said, often they're engaged with bits of theory that are a bit surprising to me, because they're not always the bits that I think are either most interesting or most kind of recent. But people do have, many practitioners, probably not most or all, have an engagement with theory. I can't think that I've ever come across a policymaker or and I use that term pretty broadly to mean people working in this field, very, who are engaged in policy and structures. I can't think I've ever come across with them who've learned very much from our kind of body of theory. I mean, you get some of the stuff around lifelong learning, which I suppose draws on people like Giddens and structuration theories and that sort of broader stuff, but not our kind of theories. So none of the things that we've really been discussing today. And it seems to me that that's a little bit of a shame, really. I mean, obviously it's a failure for us of being able to convey that we do have a deeper kind of intellectual basis for this activity than just matching people up. But I think it's also potentially a weakness of policy, is that it often develops career development policies based on very kind of rational and instrumental approaches to how people's careers operate. And I don't know what we can do about that, but it just struck me as worth observing.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Tristram. Thank you very much. Maybe that's a question for us to explore further as we theorize, and maybe think about the audience for our theorizing. Perhaps not just exclusively thinking about career development practitioners and clients, but also thinking about the sort of wider policy nexus. And I do wonder whether some of our career theory could be extremely interesting and stimulating and quite critical for policymakers to reflect on. Okay, we're nearing the end. I just wanted to flag up some of the other chapters in the handbook that we've not managed to kind of speak to today. David Bluestein and Elaine Gutowski and Maureen Kenny, Whitney Irby have written on the decline of decent work in the 21st century. So that's really drawing from the psychology of working theory, which I'm sure many of you will know is of great interest right now. And some of the posts in the chat there's a debate about precarity, I noticed in the chat. So I think that chapter will be highly relevant to that. We have a chapter on the economic outcomes of career development from Chris Percy and Vanessa Dodd. A chapter from Tristram, a critical approach to career development and human capital theory. We have a new taxonomy of educators and employer links from Christian Percy and Elnaz Kashef-Pakdel. We have the organizational studies field represented. In addition to Kate's chapter, we have a chapter from Hugh Guntz and Wolfgang Mehrhofer on organizational and managerial careers, a co-evolutionary view, and they discuss the social chronology framework. And interestingly, in terms of integrating the field, they link that back to the sociological origins of career. We have another integrative chapter on from Jerome Rossier and colleagues on the narrative turn in career development theories. A chapter from Barry Irving on social justice, the positioning of social justice and different definitions of this much used term. We also have a chapter on career development theories from the Global South by Marcelo Ribeiro, which offers a critical take on some theories of the Global North and makes a case for intercultural dialogue. We have a critical take on cross-cultural career psychology from Graham Stead and Ashley Pocklar, and a chapter on the role of labour market information by Jenny Bimrose, asking, is it pivotal or peripheral? We also have a chapter from Tristram and Tom Staunton, which looks at the role of digital technology in career development. And again, a number of the chats picked up on this, and particularly in relation to the COVID era, in that the COVID seems to have magnified developments that were already current in society about moving online and the role of the digital. So that hopefully that's a fairly relevant chapter for people. We've also got a critical review of client-centered career development practice from Barbara Bassett, an overview of the evidence for career counselling from Susan Whiston, and a chapter on evidence-based practice for career development from Peter Robertson. So there's a wide range of chapters for you to enjoy, hopefully speaking to these three areas of careers work that we wanted to focus on: the policy side, the theory side, and the practical side. We've noticed that there's this cross-cutting interest in culture, in integrative approaches. Ron, Julia, Gideon, Anthony, and others were talking about learning today, and growing interest in international perspectives, growing interest in technology and the role of technology in our lives and in career development. So it just remains for me to say thank you very, very much to all of our participants, for our audience, for attending, which has been quite a busy session with lots of material coming at you. Thank you very much to our speakers, and thanks very much to NICEC for hosting the event. And we hope you enjoy the book, and thank you very much for your attendance. Okay, see you again.
Thanks everybody. Thanks for joining us.